All right, I'm going to go ahead and start our panel 5 today with those of us who are assembled here today. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. My name is Dr. Sharif Rasheen Janette, and I am a resident of Williamsburg. I graduated from Bruton High School in 92, Virginia State University in 96, and I just recently earned my doctorate in education. And I'm happy to be a part of you. Thank you so much. Definitely appreciate it. Thank you. I am representing the Heights Community Project today. I'm the founder and principal of the Heights Community Project. The Heights Community Project actually stands upon the radical work of Black people who fostered the school called Bruton Heights, which is now closed. But that school operated from 1940 to 1967. And the goal is to provide a intercommunal news service, Black history programs, and other political educational projects here in the city. And I'm happy to be here today. Today's panel is panel number 5, and it's entitled Black Men Navigating and Shattering Stereotypes. We have 5 dynamic speakers who's going to speak to you today. One is in person, while the others are going to be virtual. I'm going to list them in order, and they're going to present in that order. So our first person is Robert Monson Jr. Is a writer, author, seminarian, musician, full-time worker, and podcast host of 2 shows, 3 Black Men and Black Coffee and Theology. He has helped various organizations through consulting work and advocacy. Our next dynamic speaker is Dr. Lynette Nickelberry Stewart, serves as chair of the SUNY Empire State College Child and Family Studies Department. Her research primarily adheres to intersectionality perspective, which centralizes race, class, sexuality, and other identities in the construction and production of family bodily, racial, and gender ideologies. She is also the coordinator of the Empire State College School of Graduate Studies Advanced Veteran Services Certificate Program. She holds a BA in psychology from Stevens College, Missouri, and a master's and PhD in human development and family studies from the University of Missouri. Our next dynamic speaker is Alton Costin III. Is a junior here at William and Mary, double majoring in public policy and Africana studies. In addition to currently serving as the Village Initiatives Community Fellow conducting educational policy research, he is also a Jackie Robinson Foundation Scholar, a William and Mary Scholar, a Forsyth Scholar, and a winner of the Hewlin Willis Association Memorial Scholarship. On campus, Alton serves as president of the African American Male Coalition. He's vice president of the Kappa Pi chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, and an undersecretary of multicultural affairs in the Student Assembly. And last but not least, our last dynamic speaker in order will be Lydia Quarles Archibia, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced, is a researcher, writer, and public speaker who addresses historic and contemporary Black equestrianism inspiration from a class in African history. As a youth and family history and values imbued, Ms. Archibia with lifelong passion for African and African American history and culture. A love of horses combined with overarching interest in Black history undergird her research, writing, and presentations, linked with values of inclusion and fairness. These concentrations drive the vision of Ms. Archibia's call for equestrian equality, currently a groom in training at Red Horse Equine Training and School. Ms. Archibia works with horses of various breeds and levels of training and domesticality. First-hand experiences with various equines add substance and context to her research and enriches Ms. Archibia's understanding of the horse and human bond. Lydia currently resides in Louisa County, Virginia, near the epicenter of Virginia horse activity in history. Let's give a warm round of applause to our dynamic four speakers today for Black men navigating and shattering stereotypes. Our first speaker is Robert Monson.
Hello. Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Well, it is a pleasure to be with you all. And I wish I was there in person, but I could not be. So thank you all for the pleasure of being before you. So I wanted to start my time before you and with you on speaking on Black male softness in a cruel age and a cold age with a time of grounding. And I do this whenever I speak because I don't know how you all are entering this space. Some of you have children, some of you have jobs that are wearing on your nerves. And as a time to practice softness, I want to softly land into my speaking. And I will be reading just a portion of this book from Black Imagination, and it's curated by Natasha Marin. So if you need to close your eyes for a pair of seconds, if you need to breathe deep, go ahead and do that. And yes, and this portion is written by Kilam Tel Aviv. I have never given voice to this, but I have always felt conspicuously unsupported by and unsafe in the world around me. For years, I have normalized and become numb to the nation's animosity toward Black men. American society imposes limits on me, limitations set only by the color of my skin. To break through society's glass ceiling for Black men, I must be exceptional. My gut reaction to feeling unsafe is to rebel. I rebel against any limitation or expectation set for me and push boundaries on my own terms. A world where I felt safe, valued, and loved would be one where society was equitable and supportive for all people, including me. I say. So I start with that because this book, Black Imagination, is this curated work of reaching for a world where Black people, Black men, Black women, all Black people, all Black flesh across the gender spectrum can feel safe, valued, supported, and one where we can be at peace with one another. And today I'm speaking on softness, and I name myself here as a proud and soft Black man, a Christian, but not the soft, but not the Fox News soft kind. And truth be told, I wasn't always a Christian. I grew up as an atheist, a curious and inquisitive one that was curious about the world. And I retain those qualities even now. And with that said, let's get into it. And feel free, if you have comments, drop them in the chat. Other speakers may not like that, but go ahead and interact how you be interacting. So I'm here talking about softness as it relates to Black men in society. And I realize that being soft is often used pejoratively. Boy, you being soft. Look at that soft kid over there. And I'm from the South Side of Chicago. And up until recently, have never heard this term used in a positive sense, right? And so I'm going to say at the front end of my speaking that the primary and the practical ways that I have learned how to be soft in this cruel world has been through therapy, right? And I realize that's a luxury, but therapy has helped me making time for meditation and contemplative prayer, reading many books by Black women on spirituality and life and love have helped to interrogate my ethics of softness and how I am to move about this world. And I would be remiss, especially because I have some friends in in here, I would be remiss not to name Bell Hooks and her work in leading me to interrogate an ethic of love and softness. Uh, I am indebted to Bell Hooks and also Audre Lorde, who we will look at some of her work here. And lastly, what has helped me to come to this ethic of softness is fostering relationships with other Black men who are on the road to emotional health, right? So what is softness? What is it? How do we define it? For me, softness is an ethic. It's a way of being in this world that stands in direct contrast to the coldness and the hardness of, especially in America, this anti-Blackness that we receive in this evil age. Yeah, that's what softness is. Softness is also, it answers the question of whose little boy are you? So in James Baldwin, who I recommend a lot in The Fire Next Time, he is in this incident in his formative years where he comes across this older person, and she looks at him and she says, whose little boy are you? And that question strikes him at the heart. And the book kind of unfolds all that he goes through to kind of answer that longing of whose little boy am I? And for Black men, there is this longing for answering that. And often I know that I have answered that in a false way. And many Black men are trying to answer whose little boy are we? Yes. So I want to turn to another example from the prolific Audre Lorde, where she was struggling to teach her son softness. And you can find it in Sister Outsider. Claps for if you've read Sister Outsider in her essays here. Yeah, so there's an essay that I think is particularly, yeah, okay, I see that. I see those hands. I see those hands. Yeah, yeah. Hey, touch your neighbor and say, Sister Outsider. Yeah, I think Sister Outsider, the essays here are helpful, not just for thinking about gender dynamics and softness, but just looking at life more holistically. And here in Man-Child, the essay Man-Child, she is encountered with her son is being bullied. And she finds that she has this internal battle with teaching him how to man up, right? And so I want to just read this portion really quickly. When Jonathan was 8 years old and in the third grade, we moved, and he went to a new school where his life was hellish as a new boy on the block. He did not like to play rough games. He did not like to fight. He did not like to stone dogs, and all this marked him early on as an easy target. When he came in crying one afternoon, I heard from Beth how the corner bullies were marking Jonathan and making him wipe their shoes on the way home whenever Beth wasn't there to fight them off. And when I heard that the ringleader was a little boy in Jonathan's class, his own size, an interesting and very disturbing thing happened to me. My fury at my own long ago impotence and my present pain at his suffering made me start to forget all that I knew about violence and fear. The next time you come in here crying, and suddenly I caught myself in horror. Lessons in the corruption of power that might makes right. And no, Jonathan didn't have to fight if he didn't want to, but somehow he did have to feel better about not fighting. An old horror rolled over me about being the fat kid who ran away, terrified of getting her glasses broken. And so here we see Audre Lorde fighting within of how do I teach my young boy how to be powerful, and what does it mean to be powerful versus soft? What does it mean to be masculine in a world that's trying to teach him to fight their way, right? So softness shows up and can show up in three ways. Softness individually, right? And the foundational identity of Black men can be one of softness rather than hardness. And the lack of softness for ourselves causes us to break our relationships. I want to say that clearly. My father is the one who taught me to be hard. And I get it. My father grew up in a time in America that was teaching him that he was worthless, and it taught him to man up. And he grew up in Mississippi. And his lack of being able to be soft cracked his own life, and therefore he abused and cracked me, right? And so I learned that I was worthless, right? And but softness can help heal myself, right? So softness individually can lead to softness in relationships with others, between other Black men, and within communities, right? In relationships, it can help us divest from toxic forms of patriarchy. I feel like every day I'm hearing of a new podcast where Black men sit around and just bash Black women. I don't know how they're able to make a profit on that, but it's a thing. I almost named names, but I'm not being petty this morning. I had my breakfast. So softness in relationships produces communal flourishing. It also helps us to divest from toxic forms of homophobia, transphobia, etc. There's healing there when softness as an ethic is embraced. And lastly, it helps us to embrace vulnerability and softness in romantic relationships, right? Which I think is what we're looking for when Black men take their place in embracing softness, rather than having to be hard all of the time, front facing as being hard and presenting as being hard. Why is this all relevant? And I'll wrap this up in this. Because the lack of an ethic of softness is breaking down our communities. It is cracking men's psyche, and it is causing severe damage across the gender spectrum as men struggle under the weight of untold traumas, right? Without the ability to be soft with ourselves or one another, anger rests like a cloud that is simmering for us. It's cracking us, trying to be something we're not. We also know that softness can kill us. It can make us vulnerable, right? Because the world is not ready for Black men to be soft. Perhaps that is why the tool hasn't been given to us young Black boys who one day grow up to be Black men. For every person who wonders why Black men don't cry or show affection, we merely have to look around our society at the news reports to see what happens when Black men are caught slipping. So part of the healing work is depicting Black men, beholding Black men as we are, and I leave us with a few practices that I do to embrace my softness in this healing work individually. I have a front facing, work that I'm doing, but individually, I have a practice of starting my day and ending my day with contemplative prayer, as I said, with candles. When I light a candle at the beginning of my day, it signals, hey, I have permission to enter this day soft and slow. And as I light a candle at the end of my day, it says, we've come to the end of our day here. You can take off the cape, and I also drink tea as a way to slow down. My father didn't have permission to slow down, but I have permission that I give myself, right? So softness is possible for Black men in an anti-Black world. It's hard, but it's possible. Amen.
Thank you so much. Let's give him a round of applause, please. All right. Might there be questions for Mr. Monson at this time? Any questions? Yes.
I'll ask a question. Can he hear if I speak up?
I can indeed hear you.
Wonderful, thank you, and thank you for your remarks this morning. You alluded to, but didn't fully color out what sounds like a transformation in your life, where you learn one way of being, and you talked about your father. Was it these authors that you mentioned that created the transformation, or were there lived experiences that worked alongside those? I'd like to hear more about your growth into giving yourself and perhaps others this permission for softness.
Yes, thank you for asking this question. There's some people who are in here who have seen the growth, so I don't want to get to lying. So I think part of what I needed was of almost a prophetic vision of what is possible first, and that's why I listed authors, because I did not know people around me showing me a way that was different, right? So part of the growth was first seeing that there was a type of manhood, masculinity that was different than the direction that I was headed down, right? I saw what my father did to survive and just make it. But I knew there was destruction there, right? But there was no other pathway. So for me, I think, so there was authors that really resonated with me when I first read Bell Hooks. I thought, I want some of that, but I was scared because is that possible for men, right? Men who love expansively, men who are good to one another, good to their women, good to the world. I thought, is this a dream, right? And then in therapy, that helped me realize a lot of the coping mechanisms that I had were toxic, that I was a toxic minefield. So yes, so I think those two things, that authors helped give me a vision for more, and then therapy helped walk me through that. And then I think friends who knew that I could be better helped hold my hand in that transformational process. So I think that those three things, among others, was a possibility. I think Shattering Stereotypes sounds cute, but I think the everyday ugliness of it, especially for Black men, I think it just was very ugly for me personally.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And so now we're going to move to our next dynamic presenter today. And that presenter that is next is Dr. Lynette Nickelberry. Round of applause for Dr. Nicholson.
Sorry about that. It took me a second to figure out how to start my video. I actually do have slides, so I am going to share my screen, only because they keep me organized. Okay. Fantastic. Let me know if you can see the gentleman on the subway. All right, excellent. So first, I want to thank Robert for that fantastic and enlightening and nuanced new conceptualization of what Black manhood can be, and some might argue should be. My research centers around allowing Black men to conceptualize, reconceptualize Black masculinity on their own terms in a similar way, drawing from actually my dissertation, which I completed in 2010. I know I'm old, folks, and an important topic that I wanted to revisit. And so I'm so honored to be among like-minded scholars whose passion for a better understanding of and a supporting of scholarship and philosophical contemplation of Black masculinity has brought us together today. So I appreciate that. Forward. Oops, too far forward. There we go. So my research is grounded in a couple of important and well-known linking theoretical frameworks: critical race theory and intersectionality. Many of you are familiar. Critical race theory, of course, asserts that race is socially constructed and that racial differences are invented, perpetuated, and reinforced by society's white supremacist agenda. You know, no surprise there. It also posits that racism are not simple acts of individual prejudice or biases, but are embedded in institutions and policies that, again, reify a patriarchal and white supremacist agenda. Intersectionality, of course, is an important perspective that recognizes the multiple forms of inequalities that pertain to multiple identities that we all embody, and the way in which they are interrelated and manifested in different contexts, right, over time. Originated by the critical race scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, but of course has been deployed in and across many of the social sciences to address lived experiences of a number of countless marginalized groups, including Black men, of course. Each of these overarching standpoints provided the rationale for my research. It helped me to determine the aim of my questions, shape my methodology, influence my data collection, provided the framework for analysis, and allowed me the lens through which I could, as an outsider, as a Black woman, begin to interpret and share the story shared with me by the gentleman who participated in this study. I got multiple screens going at once here. Forgive me. In order to talk about masculinity and as a developmentalist, I often think about identity development, which brings us to the concepts of stereotypes, which is really the center topic of this particular panel. Identity is constructed and performed across intersecting social domains or social relationships and social categories like race, religion, ethnicity, and the many others are important components to the development of self-characterization and self-esteem. And they carry with them, each of them, their own set of expectations and stereotypes. There are stereotypes about what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man and what it means to be Black and what it means to be a Black woman and a Black man or a Muslim Black woman or a Christian Black man or so on and so forth. And so many studies of marginalized groups have noted that the self concepts of members of those marginalized groups often suffer under the burden of many negative stereotypes, right? Either because of a lack of opportunity to control the projection of themselves, right? The definition of themselves, or because of the weight of trying to live up to stereotypes that are associated with being a member of a particular group. None of this is new to any of us, I know. No. Okay. So the purpose of my research really was to expand the discussion around stereotypes of Black masculinity by offering insights into the impact of Black men's self-monitoring of different definitions and expressions of masculinity in different contexts, right, in different social situations. For the purposes of this story, or this study rather, I use the word manhood as opposed to masculinity, and that was a shift that actually took place within a few of my interviews, as the gentleman I spoke to made the distinction between masculinity as a broad term and manhood as a term specific to a certain mature version of masculinity. So they really wanted to talk about what it meant to be a man and not just what it meant to be male, or as they defined it, or just to be masculine. And so from that point forward, I used the word manhood because they told me that was what I was going to do. That's exactly what I did. Slides are up. Some of the early works, this is the slide we're looking at here, some of the early work on perpetuated stereotypes, are some familiar ones, Moynihan, Fraser, who collectively asserted that, Black men were absent in the home and contributed to a lack of socialization for Black boys. And they assumed that Black boys were growing up in homes without proper role models. You get the tangle of pathology concept from this early body of work. Later, we get Gibbs, who talks about the majority of Black men are unemployed, criminalized, absent, or unwed fathers, mentally ill, victims of crime, or perpetrators of crime. That idea that Black men are endangered species. My assertion is that these and many other narratives have reified stereotypical images of Black men. And they fail to consider the systemic forces that compound the difficulties faced by Black men. Yes, some of these things are in fact elements of the Black male experience, but there has been too little research that represent the systemic oppressive power and privilege dynamics that contribute to the perpetuation of many of these social ills. And so I wanted to, of course, consider perceptions of my participants' notions of manhood within the context of a social system that closes in on them, confines them, shapes them, and in many ways limits them in terms of their self-definition. I did that one. Slides are out of order. So my methodology. For my research, I did semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and used in order to gain a holistic and in-depth collective perspective. There was 24 total participants, 15 men were interviewed one-on-one, 9 volunteered for 3 separate focus groups. My focus groups took place, most of them on a college campus. I was still in grad school. 2 of them did. And then one of them actually took place in a barbershop, which was a fascinating experience and very insightful. My one-on-one interviews took place at various locations that were comfortable for the gentleman and for them to be easily accessible as well. The interview questions were developed from an intensive review of the literature on African-American men, masculinity, gender roles, gender scripts, stereotypes, and gender interactions, and guided by a critical intersectional analysis of Black men's responses to stereotypes as it relates to the internalized meaning of manhood. The focus group questions, which came secondary, emerged out of questions and themes that emerged during the interviews, so that the focus groups were really an opportunity for me to develop a sort of collective insight into some of the themes that arose in the one-on-one interviews. My methodology in a nutshell. Of course, there's much more to it than that, but we won't go into too many details there. They're really boring. So my questions, my research questions, and ultimately my interview questions were centered around 5 themes, right? How do you conceptualize manhood, right? How do you define manhood? How do you express manhood? What are the influences of your conception, right, your definition of manhood, and what are the influences of your expressions of manhood? And then my final question had to do with what are the contexts in which those notions of manhood might change, right? What situations have you found yourself shifting in how you both think about manhood and present yourself as a man in the world? These are my demographics, and I'm not going to read them to you, of course, but just in some, my participants were ranged in the age between 18 and 62, with an average age of 34. An educational attainment, everything from high school to a doctoral degree, with most of them having been high school graduates, all of them having at least been high school graduates. Many of them, about half, had attended some college. The median income range was between 31 and 75,000. And at the time of participation, most of them were married, 6 of them, so a little less than a quarter were single. Many of them were living with their partners. And one actually was in a mutually consensual, non-monogamous relationship. 18 of them were heterosexual, so primarily a heterosexual sample, and one was identified as predominantly heterosexual, but occasionally homosexual, and another identified as homosexual. And so my themes. A few themes emerged that, and this was a broader, again, this is a dissertation, so there were a number of themes. This is a small piece of it that's centered around stereotypes. And so some of the themes that were specific to stereotypes had to do with the pressure that many of my participants discussed pertaining to having to self-monitor and self-modify, particularly when navigating predominantly white spaces in an attempt to subvert stereotypes. One gentleman said, I had to do it with my peers I hung out with. Even in the white neighborhoods, you always had to disassociate yourself from the stereotypes. When you get mad, you can't be the angry Black man. If you use slang, you can't use too much slang. If you use slang, don't let it be the Black slang. Use some pop slang like bro or dude. So I was getting conscious of that, being in a white neighborhood and not saying the Black slang, and then thinking I was all right. Another theme had to do with other ways of subverting stereotypes. One gentleman said, now, as a Black man, you are required to be 3 times as much in this country. You are going to have to be on top of your game every breathing hour of your life. And it's a tall task, no joke. You have to have the answers, be above the rest. When the rest fail, you're going to have to shine, be the beacon, because that they assume that about me. They assume about all of us. It's a tall order, but you don't have no way out. So the assumption, of course, that many of us have felt and articulated this, that you have to be better than everyone else, right? That in order to even rise to the level of others, you have to outperform to get there. Another gentleman or several gentlemen spoke of countering low expectations, right? And being acutely aware of what the negative stereotypes associated with Black masculinity meant, and that they had to do something in order to avoid those. As a Black man, this gentleman says, I feel I have to prove myself, make sure I have all my ducks in a row so I'm on the same level. Like I got some friends, and this goes back to being responsible. I say to them, you're Black, so that means that expectations for you are lower. There were a number of other things that I didn't really include in here for the sake of time that centered around agency and opportunities to resist stereotypes by just being yourself. One gentleman says, I'm pretty much the same no matter where I go, but no matter where you go, your behavior is going to change according to the environment. As far as how I present myself, it doesn't change. I go to church with a lot of white people, and in that environment, I try to fit in what they are doing so they don't see me as different. So there's this sort of negotiation, almost a conflict, a contradiction in trying to be agenic, trying to be self-defining, but being conscious of various contexts in which they have to draw back, or in some cases, draw out some of the Black stereotypes. There were gentlemen who talked about having to be more Black in Black contexts. And so the notion of context really, and how Black men perform Black masculinity really became a central theme in this research. Looking at my time, how am I doing? Final slide. So in summary, navigating predominantly white spaces became a central theme to an influence in how Black men at least performed, right, expressed their Black masculinity. There was, in many ways, an overemphasis on ideal representations. In other words, they had to outperform. They had to be the best. They had to be best dressed. They had to present their best foot forward, which resulted in an idealized manhood as a form of stigma management, right? In order to, again, subvert any sort of negative assumptions so that they weren't assumed to be like the stereotypical Black man. There was a potential to deny Black men the freedom of self-definition in this act of self-management. And then there was the bestriding of the line between context and agency that I just spoke of. And yet many of them still felt self-empowered in most situations to, as one gentleman said, just do me, ultimately. So there's a lot of interesting and contradictory notions that came out of this piece of my research. And I wanted to be able to share that with you today. So I'll take any questions.
To our last person. So coming to the stage is Lydia.
Linda Aronson. I
Lydia,
can't get it right on a good day.
Lydia Arancibia. Let's give her a round of applause, please. Thank you.
I am too. I'm just figuring it out as we go.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I've got to talk about Phineas Taylor Barnum and European royalty and men enslavement got you here today, and I'm glad that it did. And we'll get to that. Hi, my name is Linda Aronson, and I research, write, and talk about Black equestrianism.
It's not appearing in Zoom via. Let's try this. Okay, can you
Okay.
see it on Zoom now? Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
I can see it. I hadn't clicked yet. So I research, write, and talk about Black equestrianism, and I do that because of the love of horses, but also because I think that any story that pertains to Black history has a counterpart in Black equestrian history. And just in listening to the other presentations today, I hope you'll see the connection. So what I want to talk about today is the fact that not only are Black people in every other sphere of life being stigmatized and stereotyped, but it happens in the horse world, and we have countless examples of it. But I want to share with you today 4 dynamic lions in the horse industry that have superseded some of those, and I want to talk about how they superseded them. So some years ago, I was talking, this is an example of stereotypes. Some years ago, I was talking with, oops, I didn't want to go there yet. Some years ago, I was talking with co-workers, and I was sharing with them what I call my big fat equestrian dream. And this young white male millennial said, I can't imagine a Black dude on a horse. I would imagine he would say, I'm scared. And I thought, well, they're sure small imagination. And then some years later, I was at a book talk and someone about the horse, the evolution of the horse, and someone asked me why I was there. And I said, well, because of the subject matter, but then I gave them what they wanted. And I said, well, I'm here to research African-American horsemanship. And so an elderly white gentleman heard me, and he came over later and he was being friendly. And he says, you know, there was a time when there were lots of Black men, but in the industry, but Black men got to the point that they felt they didn't want to muck stalls. They were too good to muck stalls. And so now it's mostly Mexicans. And I gave him my most gracious but forced smile and said, that's just not what my research shows. Because what that gentleman assumed, one, is that Black men interfacing with horses were, first of all, only mucky manure. And he also didn't figure in things like the Great Migration, which caused Southern Blacks, because of life and death issues, to say nothing of Jim Crow policy and lifestyle, to migrate northward distancing themselves from the rural environment and therefore horses. Okay, so I say all that to say that if I'm winging it, I'm winging it, because I've had a battle with Microsoft for the past 3 weeks that they keep stealing my files. And even this morning they said, you can't undo that. And I said, that's okay. I know what I'm talking about. Okay, so go with me. So those are examples of how even in the context of horsemanship, Black men are marginalized. Now add to that stereotypes in general, paternalism in general, racism in general, and elitism naturally associated with horsemanship, and the idea of Black horsemanship or Black equestrianship doesn't enter the mind of most people. Now I was going to make a dramatic slide and say, but then this happened, okay? And Hindi's wonderful, I think, statue, Rumors of War, showed up parked in front of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts with a Black man with dreads and Nikes and whatever. And so it causes you to think about what horses have traditionally represented in humankind. And so we see a young Black man there, okay, at that time. And not only did that happen, the Netflix gave us in March 2021, Concrete Cowboys, a film about real life cowboys and cowgirls in Philadelphia. And then in September the same year, they did a do-si-do and gave us The Harder They Fall, which featured an all-star cast of a wide range of historical equestrians. The idea of Black equestrianship had hit the air. Still, most people, when they think of Black horsemen, think of cowboys or buffalo soldiers or jockeys. And to challenge that stereotype, I present to you 4 horsemen. And the reason I'm going to do it is because I want to challenge the view of Black males as a monolith. I want to reclaim the history of Black males, or the humanity of Black males, and to glean messages and lessons from these models that we're going to look at that can serve as beacons of hope, light, and capacity for Black men. Their stories are familiar yet extraordinarily different or diverse. And I wanted to keep that in mind because as Black men, their stories and their experiences are very familiar. But at the same time, they're very different. And so first we're gonna, and I don't know how to do a clicker, but in the upper right, we have Dr. William Key, sometimes known as Doc Key. Next thing we have Jefferson Todd Goodwin in the red jacket. Got Tom Bass here and Mikkel Proctor. And we're going to start out with Dr. William Key. He is perhaps the most interesting of all of them. I've been reading about Dr. Key for a while, and I couldn't figure him out until this book. Highly recommended it. It's Beautiful Jim Key, The Lost History of a Horse and a Man Who Changed the World by Mem Iker Reedus. Okay, when you read about Dr. Key, you'll read all kinds of fantastic things, and he will leave you scratching your head. Dr. Key was a horse whisperer who was famous for, actually the horse was initially the famous one, Beautiful Jim Key. Beautiful Jim Key came around and could spell, do math, change currency, discuss politics, quote bits of things from the Bible. And he did the circuit, the World Exposition Circus. Now, the story of Beautiful Jim Key is an interesting one, and it gets into my first question. What does P.T. Barnum, an enslaved man, and a horse in the Arabian desert have in common? Well, this horse is Beautiful Jim. Dr. Key here was, and I handed out some things to you because I didn't want to give you a slide with a bunch of words on it. But if you look at it, Dr. Key did many things. He was a horse whisperer, formerly enslaved, also known as Bill Key, Doc Key. He was a horse whisperer, a self-taught veterinarian, and entrepreneur. He made a liniment called Keystone Liniment. He was a human and equine dentist. He was a horse trainer and breeder, a Civil War veteran, a showman with Beautiful Jim, and the owner of a minstrel troupe. And one of the things that we're going to see with Dr. Key's life, and repeatedly through these men's lives are contradictions. We're going to find out that they're who they were or are, in the case of these two, is rooted in relationships, family relationships, whether those are the strained and difficult relationships that enslavement brought, or whether they're a more healthy thing. But family is crucial, okay? These men also had a tremendous sense of self. I would say a God-given sense of self. A tremendous sense of self that went beyond ego, went beyond self-promotion, but they also had a tremendous amount of empathy and love and compassion. And I think that if there's anything that these four are gonna, for me, bring me back to, is the old-fashioned notion of love, compassion, and empathy. And I sat there as I listened to talk about softness with Black male. Well, these guys have that. I listened to the young man just now talk about the chutzpah that Malcolm X had. Well, these guys have that. Without the ego, without the toxic masculinity. They had a call and a mission and a passion, and they followed it, and still do follow it, those two guys, okay? So that's what we're gonna look at here. So that's a P.T. Barnum, Arabian Nights, Dr. Key, okay? Beautiful Jim Key came from a famous horse named Loretta, Queen of the Deserts. And you learn real quickly that horses take precedence over people oftentimes, especially Black people. I mean, most of those horses, horse enthusiasts go through great lengths to track a horse's genealogy back to sometimes Egypt. Oftentimes they can't tell you what enslaved person bred that horse, but they can do that. Well, Beautiful Gem came from this horse. She was called the desert jewel, the Queen of the Desert. And one of P.T. Barnum's contemporaries stole Loretta from an Arab sheik. Loretta ended up in France doing the Parisian circuit. Well, over time, Loretta ended up in the United States. She was part of a circus group that fell apart. And they didn't take care of her, and her health went down, and the circus eventually went. Well, Dr. Key here, whom I told you one of the things that he had was a minstrel group, had heard about a derailed circus group, and he thought he'd go by and see if he could pick up a horse or two, because he was a horse breeder. He was a horse trainer. He was a horse whisperer, okay? And he noticed Loretta. Loretta's in bad shape. She's got a rib show, and she's not worth anything. He offers a high amount of money for her. I don't think he knew it was Loretta, but he knew horse flesh. He could recognize the quality of the horse. And so I guess the people that were former Barnum people thought, well, we do have a fool born every second, don't we? Yeah, we'll sell you that horse. And so Dr. Key brought Loretta with the intent of finding the right Hamiltonian stud for her and producing a tremendous racehorse. Well, what he got was a very gangly, weak, sick horse. And in fact, people suggested to him that he put the horse down. And I have lost my series. Okay, but he didn't put Beautiful Jim down. In fact, he loved Beautiful Jim. Beautiful Jim eventually thought that he was a dog, and so he imitated Dr. Key's dog, which meant that he slept in the house along with the dog. He eventually got so heavy he was breaking floorboards, and they had to take him out. And when they took him out, Dr. Jim or Doc Key slept from that point on with Beautiful Jim out in the stalls. Okay, and eventually, I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Eventually, Dr. Beautiful Jim began to learn things because Dr. Key loved him, talked to him, and taught him. And so this gentleman here, you don't have a pointer, but right there, oh, you do have a pointer. A.J. Rogers was a promoter. And Dr. William Key, and let me say this, as I was trying to put this together and thinking about 15 minutes, I thought, I don't want to tell people a bunch of things that they can do a good Google search and find out about. I want very much to encourage you to check these men out, but I want to tell you the dynamic things of their lives. And Dr. Key, we could talk for 8 hours about him. But in any event, AJ Rogers had heard about this horse that Dr. Key, in the course of selling his liniments, was taking Beautiful Jim with him. Beautiful Jim was quite an actor. At one point, Beautiful Jim acted like he was sick, and Dr. Key gave him his liniment, and Beautiful Jim just came right alive and whatever. So Beautiful Jim was making quite a name for himself. Plus, he could spell and do math and have political debates. Dr. William Key said that Beautiful Jim was a Democrat, and then he was a Republican. Okay, and there were people. So Beautiful Jim Key and Dr. Key spurned the beginning, or at least advanced the beginning of the animal rights movement, because then people began to say, you know what, horses are sentient beings, and this animal proved to have the capacity to do deductive reasoning at the level of the sixth grader. And people doubted it, and they thought it was a fraud. And so Harvard scientists tested him, and they said, yeah, he can. And the message was, Beautiful Jim, Dr. Key said, I've done it because of love. I've just loved him. Okay. Now, family was at the center of Dr. Key's life. This is Dr. Key at home with Beautiful Jim. Somewhere in the background, there's their dog who used to be Beautiful Jim's bodyguard when they went to the circus. Beautiful Jim's wife, Lucinda Key. Now, Dr. Key really had a penchant for family and keeping it in the family, because he was married 4 times, and the women were all sisters or related to each other. Okay, they died. It wasn't like he was cheating or anything, but stayed in the family. Lucinda Key was the first woman in Kentucky to practice medicine. She graduated from Howard Medical School, and she was the first one to notice that Beautiful Jim could answer yes and no, because she offered Jim an apple. Jim, you want an apple? Yes. And when Dr. Key came around, she said, you know, he can tell me yes or no. And she tried to prove it, and Beautiful Jim just stood there, didn't do anything. And so Dr. Key hid. She looked in and said, you want an apple? Yes. Okay. And that gave Dr. Key the sense that I can train this animal. And he did. Okay. Right? The next person we're going to look at, and like I said, I encourage you, please go back and read about Dr. And I would suggest this. You will find with Dr. Key and with Tom Bass that you'll find all kinds of mythological things about them, and some that is a little childish and whatever. But this book goes into good stuff. Like, one of the things that's interesting about Dr. Jim Key, and that made me scratch my head for many years, is he was a Civil War soldier. He went there to watch after his enslavers. Okay, talking about, you know, saving our silver. Okay, but it turns out there was a particular familial relationship there. Dr. Jim Key was quite a gambler, and so once when he was caught by Union soldiers, he got out of being hung by gambling and them having to pay their debts. When the war was over, before the war, Dr. William Key made quite a large amount of money selling his liniment. So after the war, when the Key family's house was going, and not his family's enslaver's house, previous enslaver's house was going into foreclosure, Dr. Key bought the house and sent the cousins to college. And so for years he had me scratching my head, because he's oxymoronic in so many ways, but tremendously interesting. A friend of Booker T. Washington, and I often wondered what was his relationship with other Black people. He was prominent. Just as Tom Bass here. Tom Bass, formerly enslaved, was a horse whisperer, a trainer, a rider of high school dressage. A high-schooled horse is the highest level of training that a horse can get. He was a riding instructor, a performance rider, a horse breeder and trader, inventor of the Bass bit. His quotes were, "Success is all in the training, and horses are like human beings." He was in Chicago World Fair 1893, the first place that Beautiful Jim was showcased. And he was known for his character, his integrity, and his kindness. But listen to his backstory. This is his grandfather. Eli Bass was an enslaver in Missouri, dealer in fine horses, also go hemp and that sort of thing. Eliza and Presley Gray were part of his human chattel, as was their daughter Cornelia. And Tom was a product of Cornelia and Eliza Bass's son, William. About a month after Tom was born, William Bass married a white woman. And as many enslaved men did, he acknowledged that Tom was his child, but he wasn't affording him any particular status for being that child, okay? And yet, Tom Bass, at a time when Black people couldn't do showmanship, they couldn't be involved with horses, Tom Bass became not only an extraordinary horseman, the Queen of Romania became one of his clients. Teddy Roosevelt became one of his clients. Will Rogers wrote a tremendous eulogy for him. He turned the Queen of England down from visiting him. She invited him to come to the royal horse show, and he said, "I don't travel by ships, and I don't think I'm going to put my horses through it either." Okay, but he pretty much made high school, which is high level horse performance, on the map and in Missouri. But, and this is where we get to the softness and some of the issues that we talked about generationally. Tom's father, Tom's white father, was rather condescending about Tom's ability with horses. He was very able when he was little with horses. He had a natural horse whisperer thing going on. And his father said, "Yeah, he's pretty good for a colored child." Well, Presley Gray, Tom's grandfather, was Bass's favorite coachman. And so he was glad that his grandson had a way with horses. But young Bass didn't have access to horses. His stepbrothers did, his white stepbrothers did, but he didn't. But Tom Bass got a mule who was known to sit down and not do any work to start doing gaited walking like a horse. That got his horse breeding father's attention. But still, he's a little distant with Tom. Until he became very famous, and then things changed. Bass invented the Bass bit, and it was designed not to hurt horses' mouths. And it was the first bit like that. To that point, the idea of breaking a horse was kind of breaking a horse. And Tom introduced an element of gentleness, an element of kindness. He never had it patented, because he said he wanted everybody to have access to it. And versions of this bit are still made today. This was his wife, Angie Jewel Bass. Angie Jewel Bass, they were in Audrain, County in Mexico, Missouri. Angie was the first Black school teacher in that region. Now, this is significant because Tom did not like school. He much rather deal with horses. And yet when he married Angie, she taught him to read and to write and to do math. He was known to walk around with, when he was very wealthy, a bag of wheat or corn to count out to do his financial things. So she pretty much took care of the administrative things and that sort of thing. And most sources indicate that they had a very strong marital situation. But, and here's a simple lesson. They had a contentious marriage sometimes. There were times that she left because she was somewhat off-put about his lack of education. And so she forced the issue, and that helped him because he wanted to learn more and more and more and more and more. And so then he got to the point where he realized that the best way that he could be a horseman was to learn about horses and horsemanship and money. They had a son named Ivan, not Ivan, Iden. I can't remember his name right now. But he and Tom did not get along. This son had no interest in horses. And that caused contention between husband and wife. I missed it. I missed the slide. Let's go back. No, I didn't. Okay. All right. Next, we have Jefferson Todd Goodwin. I had the pleasure of doing a telephone interview with him. It took me 3 years to get the courage to talk to him because I know nothing about horse riding, about fox hunting. And yet this man is the only certified Black master fox hunter in the Americas, probably in the world. And as a master fox hunter, or master of the hounds, he's called, he's reached the top rung in fox hunting circles. And that's a very rigorous place to be. When it gets to fox hunting, all the pomp and circumstances there, even to the how many buttons are on your jacket, and you know, there's just a hierarchy of things. The master of the hunt is the one at the top of the game with that. So I called Mr. Goodwin. It took me 3 years to do it. And the only thing that drove me to do it was because I was sitting at my son's house and a fox hunt went through his backyard. And I went out there, and there was a black man driving a truck, and I ran out and I said, "Are you with them?" And he says, and he's looking like I'm busy. I've got to get out of here. Yes, I am. And I said, "Well, I research African Americans and horsemanship, and can you come back later and talk to him when he gets out?" And he identified him as Keswick Hunt Club. So I called the hunt club and spoke with the master of the hunt there, a woman, Mary Calabrese, who took that photo. And I said, "Well, I wanted to talk with, your driver," because he was black. And I said, "And I was just thinking that I need to interview the only African-American huntsman in the United States." And she said, "Oh, yes, Todd Goodwin." She says, "This is his number," and blah, blah, blah. So I spoke with Mr. Goodwin. He has developed what he's called the Goodwin Hounds, which is its own hunt. A hunt in fox hunting is a team. So with swimming, you'd have a swim team. In fox hunting, you have a fox hunt. Tom helps establish some hunts. And in 3 years, he's brought his own hunt, Goodwin Hounds, to a level that others haven't been able to do in 20 years. This is what he told me about himself. He says, "Yes, I grew up hunting." He says, "My uncles and my fathers, and they all hunt, but they didn't hunt on horses. They hunted by foot, and we ate whatever they hunted." And yet, Tom had a distinguishing moment in which he was doing hunting with a guy, a white man, who was a master fox hunter. But that man was in the off season. On the off season, you do it with your on foot. And as one of the hounds ran out into the road, Tom went to try to save the hound. Well, that got the man's attention. Long story short, Tom begins to work in a stable. He begins to ride. And he comes up through the ranks as a master huntsman. I asked him, I said, "Mr. Goodwin, do you see," or I said, "Are you still the only one in the Americas, the only black master huntsman in America?" He says, "Yes, as far as I know." He's in his 70s, late 70s. I said, "Have you seen other young black men come through?" He says, "Yes, they don't stay." And I said, "Why is that?" He says, "Well, I've had to go through hell with this. It's been difficult for me." He says, "And also," he says, "the incentive can't be money. You got to love what you're doing. You've got to love it or you won't stay." And so, that family is important. We know that compassion, again, compassion for the animals. There's beautiful Jim, who was nurtured who learned because he was loved. There's Todd, who talks about needing to love the horses. Some years ago, he had a terrible barn fire. And he says that the horse racing community around him really supported him. And of course, he's working with the next generation, because as master of the hounds, he not only does the jumps and the hunt racing, he shows the hounds. And so he's teaching a youngster there. And that's his wife, Colleen. She's a Canadian, his right hand, and together they co-labor with Goodwin Hounds. Next, we have Mikhail Proctor. This guy, read about him a couple of years ago, hard to track. But I was excited when I talked to him and said, "I'd like to talk with you about you at a talk," because his story embodies that of all the previous ones, okay? Mikhail is 34 years old. That's his horse, Goliath. Mikhail did not start out on horses. Nobody in his family was involved with horses. And he says the industry is such that nobody's going to give you anything. He says it's not a matter of starting out without a tool, without the right tools in your toolbox, you start out with no tools at all. But Mikkel is a vaulter. And vaulting, and again, these guys are the very top of even the topper events. A vaulter is described as somebody who does acrobatics, gymnastics, and dancing on the back of a moving horse. And in fact, today, Goliath and it's such an irony, today Goliath and Mikkel are getting back off of COVID, back in the loop with competitions today in the very town that Todd lives in. They don't know each other, and I could look each other up. There's Mikkel vaulting. And I've loaded this one with quotes because I think one of Mikkel's strong points, he should be a motivational speaker. These are things, we spoke for 2 hours, and he says, and this goes back to a sense of self that all of these men had. When I said in the beginning, they had a sense of self that went beyond arrogance. Mikkel says no is not an answer to anything. When you hear no, it just means this is not your time. He also says you have to show up physically. Show up and be prepared to work. Drive coupled with showing up 100%, 110% has got to be your norm. He says the continual learning experience. No one knows it all. If they say they do, then that's not the person you need to listen to. This is a 34-year-old talking to a 67-year-old me, and I'm thinking, what wisdom? He says, show up and be the diversity you want to see. Now, this came up because I said, talk to me about being a vaulter in an arena where most vaulters are white females. What does that mean for you? He says, well, for one thing, he says, I never let my color define me. He says, now I'm not turning a blind eye to the issues. He says, they're there. He says, I want to see diversity. He says, but when it comes to dealing with horses, your involvement with horses or your involvement as an equestrian is not based on what color you are. Your involvement with horses is based on your involvement with horses. And he says, but having said that, he says, so that's so much of who I am, because his background is that his parents, again, they're working class. He knows he doesn't have, having a horse is not on his radar. So he starts to work at barns. He gets some experience. He goes on to become equine veterinarian. He does many extraordinary things, okay? Again, he's on the list. His list of activities is there. But he says, he says that, I'm flipping through now just so that you can get the visuals and then I'll make the points. But Mikkel says that you have to show up, you have to be there. And he says that he was at an event where a young Black woman who does dressage said that she felt that she had to compromise who she was, her Blackness, in order to be there. And he says it hit him like a ton of books. And he said, who told you that you had to change who you are? So I'm going to go back real quickly. I've got 2 minutes. I wanted to make the point, and we're over. I wanted to make the point that to distance Black men from horsemanship is another way of dehumanizing them, because in the same way that enslaved people brought agricultural skills here that made cotton king, they also brought equestrian skills. Many enslaved people came from kingdoms like Mali and Chad and any number of places, and they were traditional, and it was generational. And so, and even our Library of Congress documents say that there has been a Black horse presence. It's just a history that's not been told. And I love this picture because it represents what I have to say, which is cotton and the horse industry are the two industries that helped make America great. And we were cornerstone to them. The human and horse bond goes across people and culture, and to deny its reality, its presence, and its history for Black people, Black males, is another form of dehumanization. And I wish I could tell you more, but my time's up. Same with Todd. I am scratching my equestrian itch
with the question equality. If you'd like to know more about that, please get your contact information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your patience. Let's please stand, please, for exercise one, and let's give our dynamic speakers a round of applause, please. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much. I know I feel all the wiser. Thank you so much. Yeah, I was told that. Thank you so much, and of course, enjoy the symposium.
Yes, yes. In fact, please are in here. I'm sorry, I stressed you that.
Oh. Yes, yes. Yeah. It's in education, specialization.
Thank you.